All right, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you're joining from the West Coast. Welcome to this webinar titled Beyond the Headlines, Communicating the Science of Caffeine. This webinar is organized jointly by the Institute for the Advancement of Food and Nutrition Sciences, which we call IFINS, and the International Food Information Council, also known as IFIC. This webinar has been approved for 1.5 continuing professional education units through the Commission on Dietetic Registration, and attendees will receive an email at the conclusion of this webinar with information on how to collect those if you are a registered dietitian and wish to do so. My name is Brianna Laird, and I'm a scientific program manager at IFINS, leading IFINS's work in caffeine safety and scientific integrity. It's my pleasure to share a bit of the work that we've supported on caffeine safety and sources, and to introduce my fellow speakers in today's webinar. I'm joined today by Dr. Marilyn Cornelis, Associate Professor at the Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine, who will be sharing her work on caffeine health and the role of genetics. Dr. Cornelis' research aims to couple modern, high-throughput omic technologies to traditional clinical and epidemiological methods to enhance our understanding of how diet and nutrition contribute to chronic disease. She has a special interest in the genetics of coffee consumption, caffeine metabolism, taste preferences, and other dietary behaviors. Also joining today is Dr. Allison Webster, Director of Research and Nutrition Communications at the International Food Information Council, where she is responsible for developing and coordinating IFIC's consumer research efforts, as well as nutrition science-focused communications programs. Ali will be presenting Consumer Perceptions and Behaviors Towards Caffeine, highlight from IFIC's consumer research. And finally, I'm also joined by Mr. Anthony Flood, Senior Director of Food Ingredient Communications at the International Food Information Council, where he develops food safety education and outreach programs. Today, Tony will be discussing the use of science communications to address consumer perceptions on caffeine. This webinar will be interactive. We do have a few poll questions for the audience that will take place throughout the next hour and a half. And if you have questions for any of today's speakers, I do encourage you to submit them at any time using the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel. A screenshot of that is shown on this slide, and you can submit them as shown in the SNP. And I'll note that questions are visible to the staff and presenters only, that they're not public to all of the other attendees, so feel free to ask us anything. Questions will be addressed during the discussion at the end of the webinar. And without further ado, allow me to introduce IFINS. For those who aren't familiar with IFINS, we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization that intentionally engages scientists from academia, government, and industry to advance food safety and nutrition sciences in support of public health. We believe that collaboration makes research stronger, and our inclusive structure empowers our members to bring forward the diverse perspectives of the entire food and beverage ecosystem. You can read more about us and the work that we support at www.ifins.org. The IFINS Caffeine Committee consists of scientists from academia, government, and industry, and it is committed to promoting the scientific evaluation of health and safety issues related to caffeine consumption. All of the research that I'm sharing today in the first portion of this webinar was supported by our Caffeine Committee. All right, so let's start with the basics. What is caffeine? Caffeine is a naturally occurring compound found in some plant leaves, seeds, and fruits. You'll find it most commonly in the coffee bean, tea leaves, and chocolate, and it can also be synthesized or extracted and added to other food and beverage products. Caffeine is the most commonly consumed stimulant worldwide, and as such, the safety of caffeine has been studied extensively. For example, a consumer intake study of individuals aged 2 and up found that in the United States, 85% of the population ingests at least one caffeine-containing beverage per day. The mean intake of caffeine from all beverage sources was 165 milligrams per day, with coffee being the primary contributor to caffeine intake in all age groups. So as new caffeinated products continue to hit the market and remote work and school become more popular, we'll be interested to see if there's a shift in how much caffeine people are getting per day and from where. And I'll note the IFINS Caffeine Committee does have a study that's currently underway to get an updated perspective on caffeine intake from beverages. And as we start to think about caffeine and the products that contain it, I wanted to use this opportunity to do our first poll. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that. All right, our first interactive poll question. The question is, which beverage has the most caffeine per serving? We want to hear what you guys think. Is it 8 fluid ounces of energy drink? Does 8 ounces of brewed coffee have the most caffeine? 2 ounces of an energy shot? Or 1 fluid ounce of espresso? So go ahead and take a moment to tell us what you think. Which of these beverages has the most caffeine per serving? And we'll share the results in a moment. All right, I see responses coming in. That's great. Go ahead and give us your answers. Give it another 10 seconds or so, and then we'll continue on. Which beverage has the most caffeine per serving? All right, I think most of you had a chance to answer. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and close out the poll, and let's see what everybody thinks. All right, there you have it. Let's see. About 25% of us thought that the answer was an energy drink, 8 fluid ounces of energy drink. Coming in, let's see. First place was energy shot. Most people, 42% of the audience members, think that 2 ounces of an energy shot has the most caffeine, followed by energy drink, espresso, and then brewed coffee. All right, so keeping that in mind, let's go ahead back to the presentation and see what the answer is. All right, and the majority of the audience was right. That's correct, in that an energy shot does contain the most caffeine out of all of those beverages. There we go. So I'll note that this graph does show the caffeine content in common caffeine-containing beverages, unless otherwise indicated in the blue bars. All of the serving sizes listing here are 8 fluid ounces, and the data come from USDA Food Data Central. So on average, 2 fluid ounce serving of an energy shot is the heaviest hitter, containing around 200 milligrams of caffeine per 2 fluid ounce serving. Coming in second place is an 8 fluid ounce serving of brewed coffee, followed by an 8 fluid ounce serving of energy drink, which has about 74 milligrams. So the audience is pretty well versed on caffeine content of these common beverages. Energy shot having the most, followed by coffee, and actually energy drink in third place with 74 milligrams of caffeine per serving. So keep in mind that these numbers are averages. The exact caffeine content may vary by brand and by preparation method, particularly for the coffee and tea products, but these numbers can give you a general idea of how much caffeine does exist in these types of products. So it's important to be aware of what kinds of products contain caffeine and how much you might be getting, but the real question that keeps coming up, and frankly, the reason that we organized this webinar, is the question, is caffeine safe? A quick Google search on this and you'll find all sorts of headlines to fit any mood that you're in. First, 9 reasons why the right amount of caffeine might be good for you. Right? Sounds great. Okay. But maybe not for everyone. You know, dangers of caffeine for teens. What about younger consumers? Is caffeine safe for my child? Let's ask a doctor. Apparently there's something I need to know before I drink my next cup, you know, and many more. So what I and the other speakers in this webinar want to do today is to get past some of this clickbait that's in the headlines and get into the science on caffeine and how to respond to consumer perceptions regarding its safety. So to set the stage for what we know about caffeine safety and what Marilyn's going to be covering in her talk, I wanted to share the findings of a systematic review that was conducted to evaluate the safety of commonly cited caffeine intake thresholds. This study evaluated the relationship between caffeine intake and 5 adverse health outcomes. It was first of its kind in merging nutrition and toxicological evidence, and was structured to meet the gold standard for systematic reviews as outlined by the National Academy of Sciences, what was then called the Institute of Medicine. This study included a scientific advisory board with individuals that had diverse expertise in systematic reviews, caffeine, epidemiology, pharmacokinetics, and the health outcomes that were examined as part of the study. And the review itself was conducted by a team of 8 scientists from the consulting firm Tox Strategies. And I'll just note this study was supported primarily by our organization and also had unrestricted grants from both the American Beverage Association and the National Coffee Association. So let's take a look at what was evaluated in this study. For 4 healthy populations, adults, pregnant women, adolescents, and children, the study evaluated whether, in light of the thousands of new studies on caffeine safety that have been published in the peer-reviewed literature, do commonly cited thresholds for caffeine intake still hold up? For adults, the threshold that was examined was 400 milligrams of caffeine per day. For pregnant women, that threshold was 300 milligrams per day. And then for children and adolescents, that threshold was 2.5 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of body weight per day. And again, we're looking at healthy individuals here. So as part of this review, over a dozen specific endpoints were examined across 5 areas of health outcomes. These include acute toxicity, cardiovascular outcomes, bone and calcium related outcomes, behavior, and reproductive and developmental health outcomes. And ultimately, after examining all of the available and relevant evidence, it was found that yes, in healthy consumers, these thresholds that are commonly cited for caffeine intake were not associated with overt adverse health effects. So for healthy adults, 400 milligrams per day, the amount in around 4 to 5 cups of coffee, is considered safe. For healthy women, in this study, the number that was found to not be associated with adverse health outcomes is 300 milligrams per day. Both of these amounts are cited by the Food and Drug Administration and the U.S. Dietary Guidelines for Americans as thresholds to keep in mind. There are no official caffeine intake recommendations for children and adolescents, but the study found that the available evidence shows that younger consumers can consume up to 2.5 milligrams of caffeine per kilo of body weight per day without experiencing adverse health effects. So for some context, research has found that 90% of Americans do consume less than these amounts. And now that we've established these safe thresholds for healthy consumers, an important outcome of this research is that these findings support a shift in future work to unhealthy populations, to sensitive populations, and to inter-individual variability, or the effect of genetics on our response to caffeine. Which leads us directly into our next speaker, Dr. Marilyn Cornelis, who will be sharing her research on caffeine, health, and the role of genetics.
All right, I believe everyone can see my slides.
Looks great, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Brianna, for that introduction. And as indicated by my slide, I'll be presenting today on caffeine health and the role of genetics. And specifically, today's talk, I'll be covering a couple of topics. Very briefly, caffeine consumption behaviors, the metabolism and the physiological effects of caffeine, caffeine and chronic disease, as well as limitations in the caffeine research, which informs the relationship between caffeine and chronic disease, and the role of genetics. So very briefly, here's the U.S. caffeine intake according to NHANES surveys from 2011 to 2012. Recognize that this is obviously somewhat outdated, but the trends are very similar to what we see today. And generally, we do see that adults tend to consume the most total amount of caffeine, while young children tend to have much lower intakes. And presented in a different manner, looking at the proportion of total caffeine intake contributed by various sources, we see that for adults, the major source of caffeine is from coffee. And what we're seeing with young adults, the major source of caffeine is from either tea and more specifically soda. This is important to know because a lot of the research on caffeine and chronic disease is actually based on adults, and showing here adults typically consume coffee. So we really don't know much about the role that coffee plays in the health or caffeine and health among our younger individuals. So I just want to make sure that you guys have this, the context in which this research is being done. And this is also important because coffee and tea are natural sources of caffeine. They are naturally energy-free and have a host of different compounds, predominantly phytochemicals, many of which we don't really know much about, but possibly contribute to benefits and possibly risks associated with the consumption of these two beverages. By contrast, cola and even energy drinks are manufactured sources of caffeine. So they've added caffeine to these beverages. And in addition to caffeine, they've also added sugar. So clearly from virtually calorie-free natural source of caffeine, we have other sources of caffeine which provide a good amount of sugar, as well as other potential additives. And these are listed as ingredients, whereas opposed to coffee and tea, the only thing on the ingredient label is just coffee and tea because they're natural. So after intake, caffeine is typically completely absorbed from the stomach and small intestine into the blood around 45 minutes after intake. Blood levels peak after 15 minutes to 2 hours. The slight range in time here has a number of factors. It could be due to the vehicle in which caffeine is consumed, so whether it be coffee or tea or soda, but also possibly some literature suggesting whether individuals are fasted or not. So being fasted, the peak levels generally appear higher, whereas if you consume it with some foods, it could be prolonged somewhat. And because caffeine is water soluble as well as fat soluble, it's very quickly distributed throughout the body as well as the brain. Now, the metabolism of caffeine is well known, partly because caffeine has been widely consumed and pharmacologists have had plenty of time to do the research. And we show that the half-life of caffeine is actually quite variable between individuals. It can range from 2 to 12 hours. That's quite a big range in time. And this is largely due to the variability in the key enzyme that metabolizes caffeine, and that's indicated here in the red with CYP1A2, specifically cytochrome P451A2, what we typically refer to as CYP1A2. And it's the variability, the between-person variability in this enzyme, which contributes to the variability in the half-life of caffeine. Environmental factors can impact the activity of this enzyme. So smoking and also heavy coffee consumption typically induces the enzyme, so increasing caffeine metabolism, while women, specifically those who are pregnant or using oral contraceptives, this actually decreases caffeine metabolism. And there are also a number of other factors. And genetics also contribute to variability in the metabolism of caffeine. I'll be discussing that a little bit later on. The physiological response to caffeine in the amounts that we typically consume is largely due to the ability of caffeine to block the adenosine receptors and thus blocking the actions of adenosine. And by blocking the adenosine receptors, it gives rise to a number of physiological effects. Many of us are well aware of the psychostimulant effects, which is largely due to the blockade of the adenosine 2A receptors, but also the impact that caffeine has on our sleep, and that's due to the adenosine 1 receptors. But besides these ones that are well presented, people are quite familiar with them because they recognize those symptoms, you could say, or signs. There are also a number of other physiological effects that might not be as noticeable. And so this has actually kind of launched interest in understanding the role that caffeine might play in health, given that it's so widely consumed. And currently, there aren't environmental factors that contribute to the variability response. And so there has been thoughts that it's largely due to genetics, but typically for now, we don't really know the environmental factors. Short-term effects or the acute effects of caffeine are numerous. Again, many are aware that caffeine can increase alertness. It's also been a drug, you could say, that's been added to pain and migraine medications to enhance the effectiveness of these drugs. So you'll see on a lot of the packages of these, they've added caffeine. In terms of blood pressure, it has very typically acute effects on blood pressure, but these kind of wane with time. In here, I've kind of italicized tachycardia because there has been some debate on to whether caffeine does impact or increase heart rate. It could be possibly for individuals who are particularly sensitive to caffeine, maybe those with underlying heart disease. Caffeine at very high doses increases diuresis, so it's commonly referred to as a diuretic when consumed in large amounts. It also increases urinary calcium. Again, this is at high intakes. Also acts as a natural bronchodilator. Theophylline is often used for childhood apnea, which is, again, kind of pinpointing towards a bronchodilation effect of caffeine. It can also increase gastric acid secretion. And here I've noted coffee, notably because for some individuals, they don't actually experience this, but some people indicate that they have a sense of increased intestinal motility. So actually, it helps you go to the bathroom. So I just want to acknowledge that it's largely due to coffee. But while these are short-term effects of caffeine, there's great interest in understanding the long-term role that caffeine consumption might have in our health. And this brings me to the Dietary Guidelines. During the USDA updating of the guidelines for the 2015 set, they did a large systematic review on the health effects of caffeine and coffee more specifically. And for the first time, they actually included coffee in the guidelines, and they indicated that up to 5 cups of coffee per day are safe. What we've found from those systematic reviews, I'd just like to now ask the audience their thoughts on caffeine. And so we can launch the poll.
Yep, go ahead, indicate your answer, select yes or no. We'll let this run for a few more seconds, give people an opportunity to provide their answers. All right, let's go ahead and hide those results. Here we go.
All right, so now let's actually get into what we know currently about caffeine. And again, I just want to provide the context of which this research was done. Nutrition research actually has a number of tiers of the quality of how research is conducted. And most of the information that informed the guidelines were based predominantly on observational studies, because these have been going on for a long time, and they've actually been very informative in terms of chronic disease. Intervention studies, while the gold standards have also been applied to caffeine and health, these have largely been focused primarily on disease risk factors such as cholesterol and glucose. So we've actually been quite limited in terms of applying these to chronic disease. But today I'll be focusing on results from meta-analysis or systematic reviews, as Brianna actually mentioned in her talk as well, that these were largely this is largely the evidence that informed the guidelines, and these meta-analysis and systematic reviews basically summarize the results from the intervention studies and observational studies. But again, just like to emphasize that these observational studies are associations and not necessarily causality. So first, starting with the epidemiological evidence supporting the beneficial role of caffeine in health. And just to kind of orient you to the tables that I'll be presenting, I show you the meta-analysis referencing the health impact, but I also include coffee and tea because, again, most of the literature is based on dietary sources of caffeine, and those are predominantly coffee and tea in adults. And where you see 2 check marks in a particular column indicates that a lot of the evidence, and in terms of weighing the evidence, there's more evidence to suggest that it's actually the caffeine component that drives the impact on health. So in this particular case, caffeine has been shown to reduce risk of Parkinson's disease and also the progression of the disease. And there's epidemiological data and also experimental data suggesting that it's driven primarily by caffeine. So not unexpectedly, coffee and tea, which are sources of caffeine, have also been shown to reduce risk of Parkinson's disease. Benefits also are also impacted on kidney stones, endometrial cancer, skin cancers, and also oral and pharyngeal cancer. And these are largely, again, largely due to caffeine. Where the evidence isn't quite entirely sure whether it's caffeine or it's coffee, I've indicated here with equal check marks. And so benefits for caffeine and coffee have been shown for chronic kidney disease, gout, depression, prostate cancer, renal cancer, and also overall mortality. Additional benefits here, I've kept them separately, showing you that the benefits are largely due to coffee and not necessarily caffeine per se. So there's been very strong epidemiological evidence suggesting that coffee reduces risk of type 2 diabetes. One of the reasons why coffee has actually been kind of the focus is because we also see a benefit with decaf coffee. So it suggests that it's probably some other components of coffee, possibly the polyphenols, that are driving that protective role. Coffee has also been shown to have benefits on hypertension, liver health, and in moderate intakes have been associated with benefits on coronary heart disease and stroke. I just emphasize moderate intakes because after a certain threshold, typically around maybe 4 or 5 cups a day, after that point, we don't see a significant benefit. And for some, that could possibly be adverse effects. And again, as I mentioned before, with the short-term effects of caffeine, perhaps we're seeing some deleterious effects with high intake when it concerns heart disease and stroke. And my final slide for the chronic disease component of my talk focuses on the risks. And again, I have caffeine and coffee, so we're not entirely sure whether it's caffeine per se or coffee, but some data for some outcomes, it really does suggest it's caffeine, and this is what actually mentioned previously by Brianna. And we've shown that maternal intakes have been linked to acute leukemia in childs born to women who are consuming caffeine while they're pregnant. The children born to pregnant women also tend to have lower birth weight. There's also an increased risk of pregnancy loss. And besides women's health, there's also potential increased risk of pancreatic cancer. And here I just indicate some of these blank rows just indicate that there's not enough data, or there's no association as indicated here. So it's been kind of dismissed the role that tea might have in this cancer. Now, a randomized control trial has contributed a bit to the guidelines, and these focus predominantly on cholesterol. And what we've shown here that caffeine generally doesn't have an impact on cholesterol levels. Interestingly, coffee consumption increases cholesterol levels, but it's important to note that this is only for the unfiltered coffee. So if you're consuming coffee, such as in the form of espressos or French press, these are ones that could potentially increase cholesterol, and that's because these types of coffees still have the lipid component of coffee, so they're called diterpenes, and these could possibly increase cholesterol levels, and that's actually been shown in randomized control trials. So if you're concerned about your cholesterol levels but still love to have your coffee, I'd highly recommend that you make sure that you have filtered coffee, which takes out the lipids from the coffee. And tea has actually been shown to be beneficial for cholesterol levels. I think some of this is probably not new, but caffeine can potentially impair your sleep quality and also efficiency. It's also been linked to, caffeine has also had potential benefits of weight management. It's often added to dietary supplements, unfortunately, for some, and it's actually been shown in studies to have a potential benefit on weight management. Can also have benefits in athletic performance. There have been a number of systematic reviews suggesting that it does definitely have a more short-term effects on athletic performance. And finally, at very high intakes, after around 2 weeks of treatment, the pressor effects of caffeine are maintained with long-term consumption. But again, these are typically with higher caffeine intake. So while I've summarized the literature on caffeine and dietary source of caffeine in chronic disease, I'd now like to again kind of highlight some of the challenges that we have with the research that we've been relying on. Again, these are predominantly based on epidemiological studies, and these have classical limitations such as measurement error, just exactly how do we measure cups of coffee or tea and soda. It can actually be quite variable in the large population studies that we've been administering to to address caffeine and disease. And also the potential role of confounding. A classic confounding factor in research on caffeine and health has been smoking. Generally, we find that heavy caffeine consumers are also smokers, and vice versa. And while I mentioned earlier, smoking increases caffeine metabolism, there's also so that suggests that there's a biological correlation linking those two, but there's also a behavioral component, because the classic presentation of a heavy smoker, you often see them with a cup of coffee as well. So there's both a behavioral and also biological underpinning for that correlation. And because these are epidemiological studies, they do not provide information on causality, because they're basically just associations. And similar to measurement error, we also know that dietary sources of caffeine are very complex. And again, most of the literature has been focused on coffee and tea, which are natural sources of caffeine. We don't know a whole lot of information on the role that caffeine in the form of soda and energy drinks, at the equivalent amount that we see with coffee, and also in children, whether this also has an impact on health. So these are some limitations of the research. I've had a special interest in understanding the individual differences in the physiological exposure and response to caffeine that might also kind of modify the relationship between dietary caffeine and health. I've already discussed some of the pharmacokinetics of caffeine, and more specifically, the wide between-person variability in caffeine metabolism. And when I speak about physiological exposure, I'm referring to the circulating caffeine in our body. So if individuals who metabolize caffeine very quickly, caffeine does not circulate in the body, so might not have an adverse impact on health. And the flip side, may not benefit from the benefits from caffeine, because they metabolize caffeine so quickly. And in terms of psychostimulant effects, I'm sure many of you can relate to this. You probably know a few people that can consume up to 5 cups of coffee per day and are completely fine, and they can sleep soundly at night. While for other individuals, they might experience some great anxiety with just a cup of coffee per day. This clearly demonstrates between-person variability in the response to caffeine. And with human genetics, specifically the sequencing of the human genomes, I think in around 2001, our knowledge on the genetic factors that contribute to caffeine consumption behavior and also metabolism has been greatly advanced, and it's due to this large genome-wide association studies, which have recruited large population studies, genotyped them, and then correlated these genetics with their caffeine consumption behavior and also circulating caffeine. And the genetic variants that I'll be specifically mentioning are actually called single nucleotide polymorphisms. And these are basically a single substitution of the nucleotides. And these occur in greater than 1% of the population. So they're not rare, they're generally common, and they may not be deleterious, so they don't knock out a potential gene, but it could potentially modify the activity of a particular gene. And because we inherit 2 alleles from each, we inherit an allele from each of our parents, we have 3 potential genotypes. And so since around 2010, I've had a great interest in applying this new technology to the studies to actually identifying these genetic factors that contribute to both drinking behavior, but also the circulated levels of caffeine in the blood. And not only myself, but others have also contributed to this research. And while I won't be going into the details of these studies, I will just summarize the general findings. And this approach has actually identified about a dozen genetic variants that impact either caffeine consumption behavior or also caffeine metabolism. And among these are actually ranked in terms of their impact on caffeine, on these caffeine traits. And what we find is that the majority of these are actually related to the pharmacokinetics of caffeine, so the metabolism of caffeine. CYP1A2, if you recall, was a major enzyme in caffeine metabolism. It's responsible for over 90% of caffeine metabolism. Other genes in these areas are also related to caffeine metabolism, but have a relatively minor role compared to CYP1A2. So here we're just showing that pharmacokinetics do play a role in not only caffeine metabolism, but also caffeine behavior. Pharmacodynamics refer to the response, and one that you might recall is the adenosine 2A receptor. These were actually expected, but these were not as impactful as those for pharmacokinetics. We also identified a number of other variants, and I refer to these as pleiotropic because not only might they have a role in possibly caffeine metabolism, which is relatively new, these are relatively novel genes, but they also have roles in other biological pathways. So they're not specific to caffeine metabolism or response. For example, GCKR and MLX-IPL play roles in glucose and lipid metabolism. And so now I'd just like to kind of look at the directions in which we're seeing these. So if we take CYP1A2, for example, we find that a particular variant in this gene leads to high circulated levels of caffeine. The same variant, however, leads to lower caffeine consumption. So this just kind of tells you that individuals with this particular variant have a genetic predisposition to have high circulating caffeine levels, possibly due to impaired caffeine metabolism. And as a consequence, this impacts their behavior. So they naturally reduce their caffeine consumption. So we're looking at behavior and metabolism, and they're kind of inverse correlated. So this kind of points to the fact that we're kind of titrating, our genetics help us titrate the levels of caffeine in our blood to kind of moderate our behavior or caffeine consumption behavior. And while that's very interesting on the genetic level, it's also kind of crazy because obviously caffeine has been consumed very widely. And so I think over time, all of us have kind of have learned the impact that caffeine has on our behaviors and that psychostimulant effects. And so we're kind of well aware of those impacts. And we're naturally drinking to account for genetic factors in caffeine metabolism. Now, this notion of titrating our caffeine levels is not new. Actually, as early as the 80s, in these experimental studies where they kind of manipulated the concentration of coffee that was served to individuals, they found that individuals actually either increase or decrease the consumption of the coffee based on the concentration. So if the researchers increase the concentration of coffee, the concentration of caffeine in their coffee cups, these individuals naturally consume less. So they're well aware of those psychostimulant effects. And it's kind of reassuring because our body's just kind of helping us titrate the levels to avoid the potential adverse or anxiety effects that some of us might experience. And here's just kind of a hypothetical demonstration of how this is working. So again, as I mentioned, there are 3 different genotypes. And so if we take a particular variant of CYP1A2, we have an individual with the genotype that corresponds to increased caffeine metabolism. We see that with 1 cup of coffee, we see that plasma levels increase in the blood, but then very quickly are removed from the body due to its metabolism. Keeping the amount of coffee stable or caffeine stable, an individual with the heterozygote genotype has a somewhat slower caffeine metabolism. So caffeine lingers on in the system much longer. And then finally, we have an individual with the homozygote variant corresponding to slow caffeine metabolism. We find that caffeine lingers on in their system much longer. And so if we kind of add our natural kind of experience with caffeine at these different levels and say that our sweet spot here is around, is maybe 15 minutes after its peak concentrations, you see that individuals who metabolize caffeine very quickly after 1 cup of coffee kind of lose that potential stimulating or happy place that we like to visit when we're consuming caffeine. So this is when we're holding cups of coffee steady per cup of coffee. However, in reality, because we're kind of in tune with this impact the caffeine has on our mood, individuals with a particular genotype will compensate for their fast caffeine metabolism by actually consuming more. Heterozygotes will consume a little bit more, but not as much as those who metabolize caffeine very quickly. And individuals with slow metabolism will just stop after 1 cup of coffee per day. So that's just obviously just a great demonstration of how complex humans are and how well in tune they are with the psychostimulant effects of caffeine, largely possibly predicted by their genetics. Also, what's also interesting with individuals kind of learning the relationship between how much coffee and caffeine they consume and their mood. Interestingly, we also find that other factors are different between these individuals as well. So individuals with increased caffeine metabolism consume a lot of coffee, but when they do consume coffee, it's generally black coffee. Interestingly, they also enjoy dark chocolate. Chocolate is also a source of caffeine as well. And so perhaps the bitterness is also kind of correlated with that learned effect or conditioning effect that people often equate with caffeine consumption. So I think caffeine being bitter, then I'm feeling those effects. So I kind of start to learn to like the taste of the black or the bitterness. Interestingly, we found that some of these individuals actually consume decaf. And this might be a result of some confounding where these individuals might be former heavy coffee drinkers and are actually reducing their intake because of potential health consequences, and as I discussed before. And interestingly, conversely, we find that those who have a slow caffeine metabolism and naturally reduce their coffee consumption, when they consume coffee, they generally consume it with sugar and milk. And because they're not consuming as much coffee, they substitute with more water and also soda beverages. So these are important things to note. So while they're different in terms of their caffeine behavior and metabolism, they also might have other dietary factor differences. And this becomes important, and I'll discuss that in later slides. So how can we use these genetic findings? Obviously, we can implement them in risk assessment. Maybe individuals who might be at risk for some outcomes or might miss out on benefits that could be due to a potential genetic underlying factor contributing to their behaviors. We can also use this for intervention designs and kind of come up with personalized interventions based on people's genetics. I have a special interest in applying this to biological mechanistic insights into the relationships between coffee intake or caffeine intake and health as well. You can imagine the food and drug manufacturing might also be of interest in this, because obviously there's a group of people in the population that could possibly consume much more and might perhaps target their specific foods that contain caffeine to certain individuals. And there's also this an increased interest in these direct-to-consumer genotyping businesses, and 23andMe is probably the very first one that's actually implemented this worldwide, and it's been around for quite a while. And actually, individuals who have had this service have actually taken advantage of the service might also be aware that they actually include caffeine among these SNFs. And this brings me to the audience poll, and so I'd just like to I think, Brianna, can you introduce that, because I can't see it, but can you walk individuals through that?
Yes, absolutely. So the next poll question is, have you used a direct-to-consumer genotyping service such as 23andMe? Please select yes or no. All right, see answers coming in. Give everyone a few more seconds to select their answer. All right, it looks like 19% of respondents have said yes, they have used one of these direct-to-consumer genotyping services, with the remaining 81% who report they have not used such service.
I'm still, thanks, Brianna. I'm surprised that 20%. That's if we had given this poll, maybe 5-10 years ago, we wouldn't have seen that kind of response. So it's interesting. And so I'm pretty sure that those who have had the service done are probably aware of these variants. And sometimes these services provide recommendations based on those genetics. And so we need to be, cautious of where that literature is coming from. Great, I'd like to do the slides if I can. All right, great. All right, I hope everyone can see my slides again. And so we'll move on. And also kind of relevant to the genetic predisposition to metabolism and behaviors, there's also an ongoing debate as to whether caffeine is a potential drug of dependence. Now, according to the American and also worldwide guidelines, this has actually been updated. It was originally something different, but generally they note that caffeine is not a drug of dependence. However, they do indicate that there are caffeine-related disorders, and within these disorders, they pinpoint caffeine withdrawal. So this is when caffeine withdrawal is, for example, the headaches and just being very tired once you've cut off caffeine very abruptly, and that's what referred to as caffeine withdrawal. Interestingly, withdrawal is among the criteria for drug dependence. So that's why there's been some concern that maybe caffeine is potentially a drug of dependence. Obviously, for now, it's not considered one. And I'd also just like to indicate that I think that suggesting that it is dependent kind of trivializes the real dependent drugs such as nicotine and cocaine, obviously. But it does just kind of point to that there might be some individuals based on the genetics where it might be difficult for them to cut back on caffeine if they obviously need to. But as I indicate later on, perhaps they don't really need to based on the more current literature. And in terms of the science or how we can use these in the research, typically, as I mentioned, the randomized controlled trial is considered the gold standard in nutrition research. And basically, you could have individuals who are randomly assigned to treatment of caffeine or a placebo. And given the randomization, there's assumed that the confounders between these individuals are equal. And from there, you can follow over time and to see whether caffeine impacts disease outcomes. Obviously, a limitation of the randomized control trial is that they're typically short-term, and so they can't actually measure, say, mortality, obviously, or the onset of diabetes or heart disease, but they can look at other risk factors. The cool thing about genetics is where what we have now are referred to as Mendelian randomization studies. So where we take a population of thousands of individuals, genotype them, and based on their genotype, we can segregate them into different groups. So here we have a group of individuals who have variants related to increased caffeine consumption. And so that would be an indicator of exposure to caffeine. And these individuals would be compared to individuals that have variants related to lower caffeine consumption behaviors. And then you compare the disease outcomes for these individuals. And that makes for a very efficient design, especially for cancers and total mortality. But these types of approaches have some important limitations or assumptions. One assumption is that the only difference between these two groups is their genetic factors and their caffeine consumption behavior. But as I already indicated, that this is actually not quite true. We know that these individuals, when they consume caffeine or coffee, they prefer it black. So if these individuals do consume a little bit of caffeine, they're consuming more of a sweetened beverage, and they're also consuming more water and possibly other dietary factors that we have yet to know about. So that becomes some limitations. I wanted to bring that up because in the past 5 years, we're seeing these Mendelian randomization studies being published, I think, on a weekly basis, not only for caffeine, but other dietary components. And so you should be aware of the assumptions that underlie these study approaches. And this will be my final slide, and it's just to summarize, in my opinion, I believe, given all this literature, that the benefits of caffeine largely outweigh those of the risks. And this, again, I want to stress, is based on adults and caffeine from coffee and tea. And however, there are subgroups of the population who are potentially at risk, and these were mentioned also by Brianna, are pregnant mothers and possibly individuals with some underlying heart disease. So they might experience some adverse impacts of caffeine. So definitely these individuals might consult with their physicians or just limit their intake. The interesting thing with pregnant mothers is that with pregnancy, a healthy pregnancy, typically these mothers generally cut back on their coffee anyways, because it often leads to some nausea. And that particular factor actually might be a confounder in some of the literature looking at pregnant women and their consumption of caffeine and the health of their newborns. So that's just kind of a caveat for that literature. But while the benefits tend to outweigh the risks, I'd just like to also indicate that this is not a recommendation to increase intake. And this is also noted in the guidelines. They say that up to 5 cups of coffee per day is safe. They're not recommending that people up their intake. Basically, if you're an individual consuming 4 or 5 cups per day and you seem to be fine, then, and you're quite happy consuming coffee because you like it, there's no strong evidence suggesting that you should really cut back. And that's kind of very different from what our physicians or what we thought about coffee many years ago. But the literature or the research has become much more advanced. Finally, I've also discussed the genetics that might underlie differences in responses and drinking behaviors. So your drinking consumption, it might be different from your neighbors, but there could be well-known biological factors, potentially genetics, that contribute to that difference. And finally, as I kind of like to emphasize throughout, is that there's more research is needed on other caffeine sources, such as soda and energy drinks, and also the impact that caffeine has on the health of other age groups, notably our children and adolescents. So those are kind of gaps in literature that we hope to address in the future. And it's my final slide, just showing the funding that supported some of my research in this work that I presented on genetics. Obviously, a lot of the research I presented was done by others, by those meta-analyses, and also some of my mentors that I've had the great opportunity of working with since my PhD, I think at University of Toronto, and as early as 2001. And with that, I would like to just close, and we'll move on to the next speaker.
Great, thank you, Marilyn. While we change over the slides to our next presenter, I see we do have a lot of questions coming in. That's great. Keep that up for the audience, and we will have time to address those at the end. So I believe Courtney is pulling up Allie's slides. There we go. Looks great.
Okay, fabulous. Hi, everyone. I'm Allie Webster, the Director of Research and Nutrition Communications at the International Food Information Council. And Dr. Cornelis just walked us through some really interesting data, and I think set a great tone for the rest of the webinar. We are going to switch gears a little bit now to talk about caffeine from the perspective of the everyday person. IFIC has compiled this information from consumer research work that we've done. And mainly today, we're going to be talking about what are Americans' caffeine consumption habits, which products are we choosing and why, and what we know about caffeine safety, again, from the everyday consumer perspective. You can go to the next slide. All right, first, before we get started, I wanted to share a little bit of information about our organization. IFIC is a nonprofit that's dedicated to communicating science and evidence-based information on nutrition, food safety, and agriculture to the public. And consumer research is a really crucial pillar of the organization. We find that our connection to the public informs the work that we do, and it also offers insights that are valuable really across the food sector. Anyone from a person working in government to academia to the private sector to journalists that are writing about these issues. So it really spans the gamut. Most of our consumer research is domestically based, so it primarily occurs in US adults, and most often in the form of online surveys. And the data that you're going to be seeing today is aligned with that. Next slide. So as I mentioned, today I'm going to be sharing some of our recent work that we've done on caffeine perceptions and behaviors. Most of it is coming from a new survey that we just released last week, actually, and that is publicly available for you all to check out on our website, which is foodinsight.org. And to get us started, I want to learn a little bit more about what your caffeine consumption habits are with a poll question. So we can go ahead and pull that up. All right, so the question is, how often are you consuming caffeinated food, beverages, or supplements? Is it 2 or more times a day, once in a while, or not at all? Okay, interesting. So we have about half of people I'm seeing that are consuming caffeine 2 or more times a day, about another third once a day. Once in a while, another 10%, and never is only at 3%. So it's interesting. This is aligned with some information from our survey that we're going to be seeing in just a couple slides from now. So fabulous. It's nice to see a little bit of alignment there. So we can go ahead and advance to the next slide. Okay, so jumping into the survey now, as you can see on this slide, the vast majority of US adults are consuming caffeine in some way, shape, or form. In this survey, we found that 93% of respondents chose at least one caffeinated product, and we included here on this slide beverages, foods, and in supplements. This is higher than the 85% statistic that Brianna mentioned earlier, and that's likely because our survey population, of course, consists only of adults, while the other work included children ages 2 and up, so that probably skewed things a little to the right in terms of consumption habits. The most commonly consumed caffeinated products are soft drinks, brewed coffee, and tea. So that's perhaps not super surprising based on things that we've heard today. Fewer people seem to be drinking energy drinks or energy shots, caffeine from food sources, and caffeine supplements. Taking a look at the demographic differences now, we did find a common thread throughout this survey of the responses of younger people, and for our purposes, that's people under the age of 45. These responses differed remarkably from older people, so people in the 65 plus age group. And just as an example of this, people under the age of 45 were more likely to say that they're consuming instant coffee, energy drinks, espresso drinks, desserts made with coffee, energy shots, and as well as caffeine pills or supplements. And you might know that most of these are involved with getting caffeinated by methods that can deliver higher amounts of caffeine in a relatively quick and convenient format. Perhaps this might be due to some differing lifestyle habits, whether people need caffeine to study for exams, to get through weird work shifts or long hours, perhaps being early in careers or being parents of young children could all factor into this difference. So just some examples of why we might be seeing that. This information and this kind of age gap is aligned with other survey data that's out there, including a poll that was conducted by YouGov in 2021 that found that Gen Z is actually far less likely to be consuming coffee at all as compared to older generations. So they seem to be getting caffeine from different sources and not the coffee that might be more traditional for older generations. Next slide. All right, so when it comes to how often people are consuming products with caffeine, we see that 3 in every 4 caffeine consumers have it at least once a day, and 1 in 4 say that they're consuming caffeine 3 times a day or more. And as the parent of young children, this is the group that I admittedly would fall in, and it seems that I'm not alone in this based on our poll results. Next slide. All right, so we've talked about which products people are turning to and the frequency of caffeine consumption. So now let's move into the why. Why are people consuming caffeine? We asked people what their reasons were for consuming caffeinated foods, beverages, or supplements. And the most popular answer that we got was because they like the taste. That makes sense. And as we've seen for over a decade in IFIC's annual food and health survey, taste is essentially always on the top of the list when it comes to purchase drivers and motivations. And this is right in line with that. Nearly half of folks that we surveyed said that they consumed caffeine to feel awake and alert and because it was part of their routine. Fewer people chose options like to improve physical performance or because of social aspects like maybe visiting a coffee shop with friends or events. Interestingly, we did see in that other category, I know it's very small at 2%, but many of the answers that stuck out there when people were able to put in their own kind of open-ended response were for health reasons. So we had people saying that caffeine helps with their migraines, it helps with their asthma, some of those more anecdotal things. So not enough, of course, to sum up to any major percentage here, but we did see some of those things coming in the other. So just as Dr. Cornelis alluded to and talked to more about in her portion of the webinar, we did see some of those things popping up. Again, here we see differences in reasons for caffeinating between age groups. Older adults are more likely to say that they're choosing caffeinated products because they like the taste and because it was part of their routine. Well, on the flip side, younger people seem to be more likely to do so for holistic health reasons, like improving their mood, relieving stress, helping them focus, as well as for more likely to be using caffeine for social reasons and for special occasions. Next slide. So we wanted to take a look at this even further and find out more about the reasons why people might be gravitating towards certain products. And you can see a few of those examples here. So at the top of this slide, we see that people who are consuming soft drinks and tea are more likely to say that they're consuming caffeine because they like the taste, because it feels comforting, and it helps them improve their mood. Moving down the list, that brewed coffee, people that are drinking this beverage say that they're consuming caffeine because they like how it tastes, because they want to feel awake and alert, and because it's part of their routine. Those who are turning toward energy shots or energy drinks, as well as caffeine pills, are more likely to say that they are going to them to help improve their mood, to help them focus, relieve stress, improve physical performance, as well as some of those social aspects. And then last on the list, we have people who are consuming desserts made with coffee. Examples of this would be coffee ice cream or tiramisu, things like that. They're more likely to say that they're consuming these products because it feels comforting, to relieve stress. Interestingly enough, to improve physical performance was in the mix, as well as for social aspects and for special occasions. So you can think about things like birthday parties or holidays, where some of those types of dessert items might be cropping up more frequently. So there do seem to be individualized reasons why people are going towards specific products for the benefits that they're looking for. All right, so we can go to the next slide. Okay, so we have covered the what and the why of caffeine consumption, and now we're going to shift into understanding more about what Americans know about caffeine safety. And caffeine, I think, is really interesting as a component or an ingredient in many things that we're consuming every day, because as we've talked about, it does have stimulant effects, and lots of people know this, of course. That's the reason why people are turning to it in many cases. But as we'll see, a lot of people still don't know really a bunch about the details of its safety. So we started off with a pretty basic question. We asked people to identify which statement they agreed with most when it comes to the safety of caffeine consumption. And as you can see in orange here, the bright orange on this slide, about 2/3 of survey takers most agreed with the statement, caffeine is safe when consumed in moderation. So pretty down the middle response. It's not surprising that the majority of folks chose that answer. Another 15% said that the caffeine was safe in high amounts if a person was able to tolerate it, and 12% said it was safe no matter how much is consumed. And we did notice that here that younger people were more likely to be on the upper edges of these statements, more likely to say caffeine is safe no matter what, and caffeine is safe in high amounts if a person is able to tolerate it. Next slide. Okay, so next we asked people to identify the amount that they would perceive to be safe for a healthy adult to consume on a daily basis. And this is a knowledge-based question. And so we based our quote unquote kind of right answer on the FDA's cited threshold of 400 milligrams per day. And if you look in bright green here, you can see that only 1 in every 10 people actually chose that option. A full 55% actually underestimated that number, and people choosing up to 300 milligrams or up to 200 milligrams is their response. Another 3 in 10 flat out said that they just didn't know. So here we've clearly identified a lack of knowledge of this FDA cited safety number. So clearly an opportunity for more work to be done to help familiarize people kind of with this amount. I do want to call out here that we included a caveat that the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists does recommend a different amount of caffeine per day for pregnant people. And pregnant people are advised to limit their caffeine consumption to 200 milligrams per day. And one of the things that we thought about was, well, maybe we'll see this underestimation that was so common in people's thoughts around what is a safe amount. Maybe we'd see that underestimation be more common in women rather than men, because perhaps women have had experience with pregnancy or have familiarized themselves with that number, but that wasn't really the case. We didn't see a difference based on gender and that response. So again, clearly some work to be done on the communication around that bit of information. Next slide. All right, so this information comes from a different data set, our annual food and health survey, and this comes from the 2021 iteration of that survey. So this information was collected last spring. So we see here that despite not necessarily knowing much about the recommended amount or the threshold amount coming from a federal agency, most people tend to think that they know about how much caffeine is in the food and beverages that they're consuming. We see here that most people are in the somewhat agree camp with that statement. I know how much caffeine is in the foods and beverages I'm consuming. So this indicates a bit of uncertainty. But the number of people who said that they strongly agree with that statement, they strongly feel that they know how much caffeine they're consuming, it did increase in a statistically significant way in 2021 to now just over 20% of caffeine consumers believing that they know this amount. You can go to the next slide. Okay, and we have found that people say that they tend to know more about the caffeine content in beverages, as you can see on this slide, over supplements and foods. And that does track with the type of products that are most commonly consumed. So here we see that 68% of people in our survey said that they know at least a fair amount about the caffeine content of soft drinks, 63% saying the same amount about brewed coffee, and 57% saying the same about energy drinks. Fewer people say that they know at least a fair amount about caffeine pills or supplements, caffeine or chocolate, candies or gum with caffeine, or those desserts made with coffee. So definitely beverages have it in terms of perceived knowledge about caffeine content. You can go to the next slide. All right, so you might be wondering if there's a way that we can actually validate whether or not people actually know the caffeine content of what they're consuming, or whether they're just saying that they do. And perhaps Dr. Cornelis can correct me if I'm wrong, but there does seem to be a lack of recent research on self-reported caffeine consumption versus actual intake. So I don't have a direct comparison for you here, but we did ask survey participants in this same survey to rank several beverages based on their caffeine content, with a rank of number 1 being the highest amount of caffeine among the 8 options, and number 8 being the lowest. And overall, people seem to be on the right track, at least when it comes to ranking caffeine content. So on the left side of this slide, you'll see the beverage options, followed by the percentages who ranked the caffeine content as number 1. So they think that that beverage has the highest amount of caffeine in dark green. If they ranked it number 2, it's in lighter green, and number 3 in orange. And on the right side is the rank order of those beverages based on USDA's Food Data Central database. So as we can see here, most people did rank energy drinks and energy shots at least in their top 3 options. And this was followed by espresso and a pretty steep drop off to brewed coffee. If you compare this with the Food Data Central database, that has energy shots at the top of the list, followed by brewed coffee, and then energy drinks, and then espresso. And as we saw in an earlier poll question as well, we have one of the most common misconceptions about caffeine in action, that a serving of espresso has more caffeine than a serving of brewed coffee. So moving down the list, we see that far fewer people had instant coffee, soda, black tea, or green tea in their top 3 responses. So there does seem to be a reasonable understanding that sodas and teas are less caffeinated than coffee and energy drinks. Though, again, without putting people on the spot and asking for these exact numbers, it's really kind of hard to tell what they think or how much they know when it comes to caffeine content. Next slide. Okay, flipping back one last time to our food and health survey data from spring of 2021, we have found that the number of people who agree that caffeine that is naturally occurring, like would be found in coffee or tea, has the same effect as caffeine that is added, like is added in soft drinks or in energy beverages. We found that the people that agree with that statement is gradually increasing over time. In 2016 and 2017, we saw kind of the low point of that in terms of our polling, where about a quarter of people agreed with that statement. Now we've moved up slightly to about a third of people, a little over a third of people saying that that statement is true. However, as you can see here, the largest camp is those who respond that they're not sure. So again, some knowledge and information sharing to be done around the effects of naturally occurring caffeine versus added caffeine. Next slide. Okay, and this is the last piece of information I have for you, and this is in regard to what people would like to see right on food and beverage packaging when it comes to information on caffeine. We asked people what pieces of info would be most important to them, and the top response, as you can see here, is the quantity of caffeine in the product. People want to know how much caffeine is there, followed by the safe amount of caffeine that can be consumed daily, and the simple fact of whether or not caffeine is in the product at all. Those 3 things really rose to the top. At the present time, it is my understanding that labeling requirements for caffeine are basically this, that foods and beverages containing added caffeine, like we would see in a soda or in an energy drink, they have to list caffeine as an ingredient, but they don't need to indicate the quantity of caffeine. Foods and beverages that contain naturally occurring caffeine don't need to indicate that the food contains caffeine at all. It's basically just an assumption of tea and of coffee. So there does seem to be a little bit of a mismatch between what is required from a regulatory standpoint and what consumers would most like to see on product packaging. All right, so we can shift into the next slide, which has a bit of information on IFIC. And I'll just say that to wrap up, we've demonstrated here that caffeine is really well entrenched in most people's lives, and it's consumed for a wide range of purposes. We consume a wide range of products that contain it, and yet there are really some clear opportunities for education and for providing information to reach consumers to inform choices. So I am fortunate to be joined by my colleague, Tony Flood, who's going to walk through some of these communication challenges that IFIC has taken on.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ali. Thank you, Brianna, and thanks to everyone, and welcome again to today's educational webinar on caffeine. And I would be remiss to say, if I didn't say this, happy Caffeine Awareness Month as well. My name is Tony Flood, and I'm Senior Director of Ingredient Communications with the International Food Information Council. For more than 25 years, we have provided outreach, education, and science-based information to the public on caffeine and other food ingredients. While caffeine is one of the most studied and researched ingredients, consumers continue to have questions. Next slide. My presentation today will shed light on some of the common themes we've seen recently and actually fielded media questions on. In addition, I'll provide a few practical approaches to answering these questions, and finally share with you resources and links to well-known, credible, science-based resources that are currently available. Next slide. But first, let's take a quick survey. So I think we are going to enter that survey question about information sources. There we go. So take a little bit of time if you answer this one question. If you were looking for information on safety of caffeine, which of these would you most likely use as an information source? And the results are, well, the results are, of course, websites or social media accounts, 62% of you said that. Websites from the food or beverage companies, 3%. Websites and media accounts of health portals like WebMD, etc., 16. Labels on food packaging, 10. And top articles after an online search at 10. Well, let's see what our survey said in the caffeine survey that was just discussed earlier. So we'll go back to the slides. Our survey indicated, of course, that the top 5 responses are leading sources of caffeine information include labels at 49%, websites of health portals at 47%, your individual healthcare provider at 44%, moving on to government agency websites 36%, and top news search articles at 35%. It's also interesting to note that those under age of 45 tend to use websites, and those over 65 tend to look for information on caffeine from their own healthcare provider. Next slide. As Brina shared a few headlines in her opening presentation, here's a brief montage of headlines that we received in the past months. Outlets such as Yahoo News, Business Insider, and Reader's Digest all covering the topic of caffeine, featuring our own in-house experts. Next slide. Here's a quick overview of the common themes of these articles. As you can see, many of them focus on very basic questions about safety, sources, amounts, and risk versus benefit. For the most part, the actual questions that are being asked range from questions about how much is too much, what is moderate, how much caffeine is in this or that, and most importantly, which is better for me, with the emphasis on the me. Next slide. Our consumer response has evolved over the years, from simply focusing on safety to being more personable and focused on the consumer. Our consumer response with these communication strategies stem from IFIC's consumer research with Moms and Chemicals in Food, published in Food Protection Trends. This study, Shaping Health Perceptions, Effectively Communicating About Chemicals in Food, allowed us to identify practical approaches to communicating about ingredients. While the research focused on chemicals, we have found these approaches to be applicable when communicating to the public about ingredients as well, and in particular, anything artificial or synthetic. These practical approaches include meeting consumers where they are, understanding their concerns and being empathetic, answering questions directly, sharing science-based information. And most importantly, I want to share with you some of those credible resources that we identified with relation to caffeine. Those sources that we identified for caffeine are leading health authorities such as the FDA, the European Food Safety Authority, the IFAN Systematic Review on Caffeine, and position statements that were discussed earlier from leading health organizations such as ACOG and the American Academy of Pediatrics. Recalling our consumer survey on caffeine suggested that 36% of individuals sought out information from government sources, and 47% sought out caffeine information from leading health portals. About 44% sought out information from their own healthcare provider. Now you may ask yourself, where can I go to get this information on safety, sources, amounts, and even risks and benefits of caffeine? Do I actually have to search each individual website, or is there a one-stop shop where all these resources are located and easy to find? Next slide. The answer to your question is quite simple and easy to find. These resources, links, common questions, and more are all available on IFIC's Caffeine website, your one-stop shop for information on caffeine. Next slide. The Caffeine website is easy to navigate with resources and links on safety and health. Next slide. Sources and amounts. Next slide. And even a caffeine calculator, an interactive tool where individuals of all ages can easily determine how much caffeine you are actually consuming. This website and caffeine calculator are easily accessible at foodinsight.org/caffeine. Next slide. For our final slide, I've included all the links to the news articles that I showed in the montage, the caffeine website and the caffeine calculator, and the reference for the published article, Effectively Communicating About Chemicals in Food. Next slide. With that, I want to thank you. I want to thank iFans. I want to thank all my fellow presenters for your attention today. And lastly, next slide. Please be sure to follow us on these social media channels. Now I turn it back to Brianna for the next part of our webinar, which I believe is our Q&A session. Brianna?
Yes, thank you, Tony, for that presentation. And if I could ask all of the speakers to turn your webcams back on. We do have, let's see, about 8 minutes for discussion and lots of questions submitted by the audience members. So I'm excited to get to a few of those. Let's see here. So first, I have received a lot of questions about, will the recording of the webinar be available afterwards? That answer is yes. It will take a day or two for us to get that out, but that will be available. So the first presentation related question I will pose to Marilyn. And that question is, when we're talking about fast and slow metabolizers versus caffeine and how some individuals are more sensitive to caffeine than others, does this have the potential to change over time, like as individuals age? Does either your metabolism, the expression of some of those enzymes change over age, or is there some other reason why individuals might become more sensitive as they age?
Yeah, great question. Generally, up to 5 or 6 months of age, the activity of the enzyme is pretty much set. So that kind of explains why newborns tend to have a lower caffeine metabolism, but by the time they're 5 or 6 months of age, that activity has kind of been set. But the activity can change. As I mentioned, there are environmental factors that can change it. Age doesn't really play in a role. You can possibly, in terms of responses, you can become tolerant to some of the effects of caffeine if you consume it too much. You can just basically become tolerant to it, but you can actually kind of regain the stimulation of caffeine after you withdraw from it, so you can become back to your kind of a different benchmark when you've abstained from caffeine for a while. So tolerance just might be an impact on the activity of the enzyme. Some people say that these are really just kind of case studies where they find that their caffeine metabolism might change, having gone through a bout of, say, cancer or even some drugs that they've been using. These are very cases, maybe one person. So we're not sure exactly whether those kind of events have an impact on metabolism.
All right, thank you. And one more question that I'll ask you is, you mentioned that fast caffeine metabolizers may not be realizing the full potential benefits of caffeine in terms of, the correlations that we've seen between caffeine intake and certain health outcomes. Is there research on that, or is that, something that's yet to be explored?
Theoretically, that would make sense if it's caffeine per se. But what I found interesting is that these individuals who are consuming that metabolize caffeine very quickly, and as a consequence are increasing their intake of, say, coffee, they might actually benefit from other components of coffee more, because the metabolism of caffeine does not alter the metabolism of other, for example, polyphenols that are found in coffee that might, for example, for type 2 diabetes, one particular polyphenol, chlorogenic acid, is quite unique to coffee, and that might underlie the beneficial impact the coffee might have on your glucose levels. And so you have these individuals who can rapidly metabolize caffeine, therefore getting rid of the adverse impact that caffeine might have on the glucose levels, because short-term effects of caffeine on the glucose is that it kind of impairs insulin sensitivity. But if they're excreting that from the body quickly, they can still obtain the benefits of coffee itself. Caffeine, they're excreting it, so they probably don't benefit from the caffeine, but they could benefit from other things.
All right, thank you. Okay, I am seeing a lot of comments on presentations from the IFIC team saying great presentations. A lot of the questions that I'm seeing are from Marilyn. I'll throw you one more. Marilyn, when you commented on filtered versus unfiltered coffee and the potential for unfiltered coffee to raise blood lipid levels, the question that has been asked is, are coffee pods, it's like Nespresso or K-Cups, which one is that? Is that filtered or unfiltered coffee?
Yeah, these are great questions, because coffee is becoming so complex these days. You can get it in different types. I actually double checked that, but that little pod that you put in your Keurig, it does have a little filter in it, so it's filtered. I should, yeah, in most cases it has a filter, so that generally they are filtered. If you're concerned, you can just kind of double check, but they're generally filtered.
All right, great, thank you. Okay, and then a question for Allie, and maybe Tony might be able to provide comment as well, about the respondents that participated in IFIC's caffeine survey. I think I saw some numbers in there. You maybe had about 1,000 respondents. Is that about right?
That's correct. Yep, we started out the survey with 1,000 respondents. Most of the questions went to the full survey sample. Of course, on some of the questions where we asked about which caffeinated products are you consuming, those only went to people who said that they were consuming caffeine in a variety of forms. So the number was slightly lower, but as we saw in that first slide, only, I think it was 7% of folks said that that was the case, that they didn't consume caffeine. So it was a relatively small amount of the sample that was kind of filtered out for some of those follow-up questions.
Okay, great, thank you. And follow-ups to that were the respondents located in the US only or worldwide? And when was the survey active? Was this conducted very recently?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the survey is in the U.S. Only, so that we just surveyed people across the U.S. We have nationally representative sample, and we align that with the current population survey to kind of get those benchmarks and making sure that the people that we are polling and the results that we are showing you all are representative of the country, basically. So yes, it is domestically based. And I believe we fielded this survey in February. So it's recent data, just within the last month and a half or so, we collected it.
Can I just follow up on that question? The person that asked that question, maybe they're interested to see whether COVID might have impacted those behaviors. That would have been cool if you had asked that question. You thought that people increased it or decreased it. I'm just curious.
Yeah, you're right. We didn't ask any questions specific to COVID in this survey, but that's absolutely something that would be interesting to see. I'm not familiar with any information out there that would be doing kind of that pre-post situation of how people's habits have changed, but we know that for the most part, people tend to be consuming caffeine in their homes, or at least coffee in their own homes. And so if you are home a lot more, there seems to be good rationale for why coffee consumption at least would be increased. So definitely we'll be needing to take a look at the data on that one.
Yeah, and I'll take this opportunity to say the IFIN's Caffeine Committee does have a study that's currently ongoing and collecting consumer behavior information on beverage caffeine intake. Data collection started last June and will go through the end of May this year. So it's, a bit, late COVID, during, but sort of, by now we're maybe about as post-COVID as we'll be for a while. So yeah, we'll have those results later on this year, at least preliminary results. So we look forward to that. And we are right at time. So I'd like to take this last second here to thank each and every one of the speakers for participating today. I know I learned a lot. I think our audience has as well. And for the audience, I will just say that be on the lookout for a post-webinar evaluation survey. We do hope you'll take a minute to provide your feedback on the quality and the content of this webinar. We will use that to inform future events. And instructions for obtaining the CEU will also be in that email. So thanks again, everyone. It's been a pleasure. And keep an eye out for that email coming your way, attendees.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.